36-year-old Boyd Taylor was single, he had no children, and he lived with his divorced father, Robert, in a small bungalow in the northern England countryside. In addition to living with his father, Boyd also worked for his father. His father, Robert, owned a small construction business, and so the father-son duo built houses in the area. While Boyd might have envisioned his life turning out in a different, more exciting way, he didn't seem outwardly unhappy about his circumstances. In fact, he seemed very cheerful, both at work and when he was at home. But despite his cheerfulness, his father, Robert, was still pretty concerned about him, because every time Boyd had some time off from work and was just at loose ends, he wouldn't go out with his friends. In fact, he really didn't have any friends and wasn't even trying to make any friends. Instead, he would just sit in his room all day and be totally by himself. Now, Robert knew his son was naturally a bit of a loner and always had been, but a part of him hoped that his son would just start going out and meeting new people, or at the very least, develop some sort of hobby that could occupy his mind. In late September of 2002, Robert was walking down the hallway of their bungalow when he passed by his son's bedroom door, and it was shut, and as he walked past, he heard inside of his son's room the sound of his son sawing some wood. And so he stopped for a second and he just listened, and when the sawing stopped for a second, Robert just knocked on the door. He was curious. He wanted to know what his son was doing. Boyd, instead of coming over to the door and opening it up and talking to his dad, instead just paused for a second and then said, "What is it, Dad? What do you need?" And Robert would say, "Well, I heard sawing and I just wanted to know what you were building." And so Boyd pauses again and then just says, "Well, I'm working on a woodworking project." And so Robert's like, "Well, can I poke my head in and actually see what you're building?" And Boyd, again, without opening the door, just tells his dad very politely that he wants to be left alone. And so Robert decides not to push the issue. Whatever he was doing, it was his business. And so he just told his son that, hey, if you need any help with anything, let me know. I'd be glad to help. And then Robert walked away. Over the next 2 months, every time Boyd was not working, so in the evenings and on the weekend, he would be locked inside of his bedroom, hammering and sawing away at this woodworking project. And over those 2 months, Robert would periodically walk down the hall and stand in front of his son's bedroom and knock on the door and try to get his son to let him in to just see what he was up to, not only because he just wanted to see what his son was doing, but because Robert was a carpenter by trade and so was just genuinely interested. But every time he asked to be let in, Boyd would very politely tell his father that he really just wants to be left alone, and Robert respected his wishes. In early December, Boyd approached his father and said, "Hey, would it be possible for me to take the next month off from work so I can focus on this woodworking project?" Now, for Robert, this was a massive inconvenience. This construction business that he owned was really just he and his son building the houses. And so if his son was not going to be working, then Robert would be solo on all of his projects for that month. But Robert's thinking to himself, my son has finally found a hobby that he's really into. I don't really know what it is, but clearly he's invested in it. And so he tells his son, "You know what? That's fine. You take the whole month, and if you want more time in January, that's fine. You just let me know." So starting that first week in December, every time Robert would leave the house to go to work in the morning, he would leave to the sound of Boyd in his bedroom hammering and sawing and tinkering away at his woodworking project. And then several hours later, when Robert finally came back home, he'd walk into the house and the first thing he would hear is his son still in his bedroom, still hammering and sawing away. When December finally ended and Robert expected his son to be done with his project and to finally show him what he's been working on, Boyd approached him and said, "Well, Dad, I'm not quite done with the project. I need about 2 more weeks. And so Robert said, "No problem. We'll talk in 2 weeks." So December rolled into January and Boyd just continued to work all day long inside of his bedroom. Then on the evening of January 7th, Robert was home. He was watching TV in the living room and Boyd was hard at work in his bedroom right down the hall when Robert decided he was tired and he was going to go to bed. So he stands up, turns the TV off, he leaves the living room, he goes down the hallway with his son's room on the right, and as he past, he can hear his son at work and he kind of yells to his son that he's going to bed. And then Robert goes into his bedroom, crawls into his bed, and falls asleep. At 3:30 a.m. the following morning, Robert is suddenly awoken by this incredibly loud crashing sound somewhere in his house. Robert's first thought was the chimney must have collapsed. That was how loud the sound was. And so he leaps out of his bed, he runs out of his door, he goes down the hallway, past his son's room, into the living room, and he looks at the fireplace, which is in the TV room, and clearly the chimney has not collapsed onto itself. And so he's standing there thinking, what else could that sound have been? And then he's thinking to himself, well, did I really hear that sound? sound, or was that sound in my dream? And I kind of thought it was real, but it really wasn't. And so just to be sure, he walked all around the house, kind of seeing if there were any signs of something big falling and crashing on the ground, but the house seemed totally in order. And so he walked back down the hallway towards his bedroom, and he stopped right outside of his son's room, and he considered knocking and waking his son up to see if maybe he had heard this loud sound too. But when he listened to the door, it was quiet inside, so he figured, you know what, my son's asleep, I'm not going to wake him up for this. And so Robert just went into his bedroom and he went back to sleep. A few hours later, Robert got up and he left his bedroom, he went into the kitchen and he made himself some food. And as he's preparing his food, he's realizing that he doesn't hear the sound of Boyd working in his bedroom, because normally Boyd would be working that early in the morning, but he wasn't. And so right before Robert left to go to work that day, he actually walked down the hall and listened to his son's bedroom to hear if maybe he was at work in there, but he just hadn't heard him, but it was totally silent in the room. And so he reached down to the doorknob, thinking maybe he could just poke his head in and see if his son was on his bed, but when he tried the doorknob, it was locked. So Robert just thought to himself, okay, I guess Boyd is sleeping in this morning, and so I'm not going to bother him. And so Robert leaves the house, he gets into his truck and he drives off to work, and then several hours later, he comes back to the house at night and he walks inside, and the first thing he hears is nothing. It's silent. And this house in the evenings for the past several months was never quiet. Boyd was always hammering, sawing, and tinkering away at this woodworking project. And so right away, Robert's thinking to himself, maybe he's done with the project and I can finally see this thing he's been working on. And so Robert drops his stuff at the door and he walks down the hallway. He goes to his son's bedroom door and he knocks and he says, hey, Boyd, are you done with your project? But he's met with silence. And so Robert reaches down again and tries the doorknob, but it's locked. And so Robert's standing there thinking, it's too early for him to be asleep. And so he yells out for Boyd, hey, what's going on? Where are you? I haven't seen you today. Come out here. Come talk to me. But again, it's silent. And so Robert's thinking, okay, well, when I pulled in, was his car in the driveway? And he can't remember. And so he leaves the house, he goes out to the driveway, and sure enough, there's Boyd's car. It's in the driveway. So he has to be here. And so suddenly Robert's starting to feel a little bit panicked about his son. He runs back into the house and he just starts screaming his son's name as he goes room to room into the bathrooms and the other bedrooms to see if he's in there, but he's nowhere to be found. And so operating on a gut instinct, Robert just runs right out to his car. He gets a sledgehammer, comes back in the house, goes down the hallway, and he's standing in front of his son's bedroom door. And one more time, he yells for his son and bangs on the door, tries to get his son's attention. But after once again there being total silence, he picks up his sledgehammer and begins breaking the door down. And after a couple of swings, he manages to pop off the locking mechanism, the actual doorknob. That gets blown off and he can push the door open and he sees inside the bedroom is empty. There's just a bed and a dresser and there's no Boyd. But in the back right corner of the room, where normally there was like this alcove, basically a segment of his room kind of jutted away from the rest of the space, almost like it was a closet, but with no door on it, Boyd had clearly built a wall and door over that alcove, kind of creating a sort of sub-room within his bedroom. And this door was shut. And so Robert immediately runs over to this new second door. He tries the doorknob, it's locked. He yells for his son, but again, after silence, he picks the sledge up and begins trying to break this door down. And after a few good swings, like the first door, he was able to knock the doorknob off of the door. And then he reached down and he pulled the door open. And what he saw on the other side of this door, inside of this little sub-room, was so far from anything he ever expected that he just stood there in stunned silence. And then eventually reality kind of kicked back in and he ran out of his son's room and he called the police. 3 months earlier, Boyd had decided he wanted to build this very specific device that was invented in 1789. Now, he didn't want his father to know about this device, and so he built that door and wall frame in front of that alcove specifically so he could build this device inside of this new sub-room in privacy. He also always made sure to lock his main bedroom door. So for 3 months, Boyd began constructing this 8-foot tall, 3-foot wide structure inside of the subroom. And once the shell of this device was constructed, he began installing all of its inner workings. These included things like various lengths of wire and clock timers and a jigsaw, which is like an electric saw. And then finally, on January 7th, it was complete. So that night, Boyd blew up an air mattress and he slid it inside of the subroom right underneath this ancient machine he had built. And then after that, he went and locked the main bedroom door. He went into the subroom himself and shut the subroom door and locked that. And then he pulled 12 sleeping pills out of his pocket, swallowed those, and then laid down on this air mattress on his back, looking up at the inner workings of this machine. And then once he was positioned the way he wanted to, he reached over up inside of this machine and he felt around for a button that he had placed. He pressed that button, and then he put his hands over his chest and he laid there looking straight up until the sleeping pills kicked in and he fell asleep. That button he pressed right before he passed out from the sleeping pills started a timer, and when that timer went off, it would actually activate this whole device. And so several hours after pressing that button, the timer finally went off at 3:30 a.m. The first thing that happened when this device was activated is the jigsaw, the electric saw, began sawing this wire. Now the wire had been very intentionally placed against the teeth of this jigsaw, and so it's cutting this wire, and this wire is supporting this weighted down heavy angular blade that's pointing straight down. And so as soon as this wire is cut, it releases the blade, and the blade that almost looks like this oversized axe head begins falling straight down this chute, and the chute aims the blade directly onto the front of Boyd's throat. Boyd's woodworking project was a guillotine, and that loud crashing sound that woke Robert up at 3:30 in the morning on January 8th, that was the sound of the blade of this guillotine crashing down and decapitating his son. Even though Boyd did not leave behind a note explaining his actions, it was determined Boyd's death was in fact a suicide, a very complicated and deliberate suicide. Boyd's father and other people involved in this case have come to the conclusion that Boyd was clearly showing signs of depression before he chose to take his own life. And so maybe if Boyd had reached out for help, or if there had been some sort of intervention, his death could have been prevented. And if you or anyone you know is struggling with mental health, remember, you are not alone. No matter how bad it feels, there are resources out there that can help you. And so I've listed a number of them in the description below. So that's going to do it, guys. If you got something out of today's episode and you haven't done this already, please sneak into the like button's house the day before their wedding and replace their dress shoes with Crocs. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 1 or 2 video uploads. We are now selling merchandise like flannels and hats and sweatshirts. If you're interested, go to shopmrballen.com. If you want to learn about upcoming deals and promotions about our shop, go to our shop's Instagram page. The username is shopmrballen. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My username for both platforms is the same. It's MrBallen. I also have a ton of content over on TikTok where my username is also MrBallen. We also have a second YouTube channel called MrBallen Shorts where we post random short videos and lost episodes. We also have a Facebook page just called MrBallen where we post condensed versions of the longer episodes you see on YouTube. If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called MrBallen. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, Facebook, or some combination, just know that I really appreciate your support. And until next time, that's going to do it. 7th, 1908, a 34-year-old handcuffed man walked out from behind the curtain to a cheering crowd inside of a theater in St. Louis, Missouri. This was going to be this man's first ever live performance, but he did not seem nervous. Next to this man on stage was this comically oversized milk can that was filled to the brim with water. Once the audience had stopped clapping and had calmed down and taken their seats, this man on stage turned to face this milk can and then climbed up this small ladder and then lowered himself feet first into this can. And as he did, his body displaced water from the can, causing it to spill over onto the stage. And then once almost all of his lower half was submerged in water and the audience could only see his face, this man looked over at his assistants in the wings of this theater and kind of gestured to them that he was ready to start. And so the assistants come running out into the middle of the stage and they immediately close the lid of this milk can over this guy, pushing his head down into the water. And so as the audience is gasping and collectively holding their breath, the assistants proceed to lock this lid with 6 different locks around the top. And then they wheeled over this cabinet that kind of collapsed around the can, so it was totally out of view of the audience. Now, for this audience, they had never seen anything like this before, and so immediately they all began murmuring and whispering to each other, wondering how this guy is going to survive what he's doing. But 2 minutes after that lid had been sealed, that 34-year-old man emerged from behind the cabinet with his hands open wide so he wasn't handcuffed, totally unharmed. And then the cabinet was moved aside and the audience could see the lid of this milk can was still locked. During his lifetime, nobody could ever figure out how the great magician Harry Houdini had escaped that milk can. These dangerous stunts made Harry extremely famous, and it's why we still know him today, nearly 100 years after his death. But it wasn't just that he was able to successfully perform these stunts, it was his attitude while he performed these stunts that made him so notable. He really just came off as being totally fearless, that he was willing to do just about any stunt. But that wasn't actually true. There was one stunt that Harry was absolutely terrified of. Now, he would eventually work up the courage to attempt this particular stunt, but while he was doing it, he panicked and he had to be rescued by his assistants. And after that, he never tried it again. And for decades, nobody else tried it either. Because, I mean, if Harry Houdini can't perform this stunt, then certainly no one else can either. But in 1990, a daring 32-year-old man named Joe Burris decided he would be the person who would finally conquer this infamous stunt. Joe was a small-time children's magician in Fresno, California, but deep down, he had always believed that someday he would be the next Harry Houdini. In fact, he would actually tell his family that not only would he be the next Harry Houdini, but he would be even better than Harry Houdini. And so that year, he decided it was finally time to make that dream a reality. And so he saw performing this infamous stunt as a way to make that happen. So on Halloween night of that year, so October 31st, Joe, adorned in his white tuxedo, along with his two young sons and his parents, they arrive at Blackbeard's Family Fun Center, which was an amusement park in Fresno, California. The family hopped out of the white limousine that Joe had arranged to bring them there, and they began walking across the parking lot to this big crowd of people. And when this big crowd of people saw Joe walking towards them, they all began to cheer. Joe's stunt that he was about to perform that night had been very heavily advertised, mostly by Joe, and so it had become this spectacle in Fresno. It was going to be aired live on TV while he was doing it, and it was going to be broadcast on a radio station. So after Joe and his family make it over to this big crowd, Joe walks to the front and he climbs up on this impromptu stage and he gives this impassioned speech to his audience about how he's going to be the one who takes on this stunt and becomes the next Harry Houdini. And then afterwards, he looks over at his assistants, all these guys that are around him, and he gestures to them that he's ready to begin. These TV cameras rolling, the assistants walk up to Joe and they begin shackling his wrists and they put these chains around his body, and then they lifted him up and put him inside of the see-through plastic coffin. And then this coffin was lowered into the 7-foot pre-dug hole that was right nearby. Once Joe gave the signal that he was ready to go, they would fill this hole in, and the stunt that he would perform would be to escape being buried alive. Houdini had attempted this by being buried under 6 feet of dirt, and he had managed to get out of his coffin, but then he just could not get through the dirt and began to panic. And had it not been for his assistants literally reaching into the dirt and pulling him out, Houdini would have died. Joe, apparently, a year earlier, had attempted some sort of practice run of this stunt. It was not the full amount of dirt. It was some smaller amount of dirt, and he had managed to get out. And so he was really confident in himself. And so for this big televised event, he had decided to really up the ante and make sure it was clear he was not only as good as Houdini, but better than Houdini. And so he was going to have 3 feet of dirt put on his coffin first, and then 4 feet of wet cement put in on top of that. Many people, when they heard this plan, both the TV personalities, the radio personalities, onlookers, they said this was a terrible idea and you shouldn't do it. But Joe was extremely confident and brushed them off and said Joe was in his coffin at the bottom of this 7-foot hole. He looked up at his assistants standing over the grave waiting for a signal, and he gave it to them and kind of shouted up to them that he was ready. And so his team very excitedly began shoveling dirt into the hole. But after only a couple of minutes, when less than a couple of feet had been put in the hole, they heard Joe yelling out from inside of the coffin. And so everything stopped, the staff jumped in, and they pulled the dirt out until they could finally get the lid of the coffin off. And they found Joe. He was alive, but he was very shaken up, and he kind of sat up and said, yeah, the chain around my neck is too tight. You got to readjust the chain. Now, all these onlookers at this event, they heard Joe say this, and they saw him, and their read on this situation was not that his his neck chain was too tight, but rather it looks like Joe might have bitten off more than he can chew. That this stunt is way more dangerous, and maybe he's realizing that and he's looking for excuses to not do the stunt. And so the onlookers, they didn't try to egg him on to do it anyways. They started feeling apprehension too, and so everybody who was there began telling Joe, hey man, get out, don't do this now, this is a really bad idea, it's not worth it, the chain's too tight, that's a sign, don't do it, don't get back in. But Joe, after kind of collecting himself, told the group that he was totally fine, that it was really just the neck chain that was the only issue, and he demanded his staff put that chain back around his neck after they loosened it up, and then put him back in the coffin and fill it in. And so eventually his staff, taking cues from him, said, okay, and they got his neck chain readjusted and they put him back in the coffin, they chained him back up again, they closed the lid, and once again he gave the signal that he was ready to start. And so a very apprehensive crowd watched as the dirt went back in, and after 3 feet of dirt were in the hole, the cement truck came over and poured 4 feet of wet cement on top of the dirt. And then after this hole had been completely filled in, the onlookers, which included Joe's 2 young sons and his parents, they kind of moved in and got right up against this grave and were looking straight down at the top, waiting for Joe to come out again. But as they're watching this hole and as they're filming this hole, all of the cement in the hole suddenly drops about a foot. What had happened was the nearly 15,000 pounds of dirt and wet cement sitting on top of this coffin had finally caused the lid to break, and in an instant, all of the dirt and cement poured into the coffin surrounding Joe completely. He was truly buried alive. Onlookers immediately jumped into action and did their best to try to dig Joe out, but it took them 30 minutes to finally reach him, and when they did, he was already dead. Joe had ironically died on the exact 64th anniversary of Houdini's death. After an investigation, it was determined that Joe had not tested the strength of his plastic coffin against the weight of the wet cement. He'd only tested it against dirt because that was the one he had done the year earlier. He had done it under dirt and it worked. Joe had also not taken into account that cement dries from the bottom up. So even if Joe had managed to get out of the coffin and make his way through the first 3 feet of dirt that was right on top of the coffin, he most likely would have been trapped under the hardened cement. Guys, if you found the secret in today's episode, let us know in the comments section what it is and where you found it, so give us the timestamp, and if you're the first to do that, we'll pin you at the top of the comment section. If you got something out of today's episode and you haven't done this already, please ask the like button to play a very casual game of chess with you, and then proceed to beat them with the Fool's Mate. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 1 or 2 video uploads. We are now selling merchandise like flannels and hats and sweatshirts and all sorts of stuff. If you're interested, go to shopmrballen.com. If you want to learn about upcoming deals and promotions for our shop, go to our shop's Instagram page. The username is shopmrballen. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My username for both platforms is the same. It's just MrBallen. I also have tons of content over on TikTok where my username is also MrBallen. We have a second YouTube channel called MrBallen Shorts where we post random short videos and lost episodes. We also have a Facebook page just called MrBallen where we post condensed versions of the longer episodes you see on YouTube. If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called MrBallen. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, Facebook, or some combination, just know that I really appreciate your support, and until next time, that's going to do it. 27-year-old Lydia Makarchuk left her home country of Ukraine and moved to Bracknell, which is a town just outside of London. Shortly after moving into her new apartment, Lydia went out and got a job as an accountant at a local hotel, and then after that, Lydia pretty much swore off her social life and instead just focused exclusively on working hard and saving money. The one reprieve she got from work was going to church on Sundays. 2 years later, Lydia was at her church enjoying the coffee hour that always followed the Sunday sermon when another member of her church, who she didn't really speak to, this 41-year-old man named Norbert Varga, approached her and kind of awkwardly complimented her shoes. And she was so flattered by this that it opened up a friendly conversation between the two of them. And during this conversation, Lydia was pleasantly surprised to find out that Norbert was an expat too. An expat is someone who lives outside of their native country. Norbert had moved to the UK in 2018, so that's 1 year after Lydia had moved to the UK, and he came from Hungary, which shares a border with Ukraine. And just like Lydia, when he got to the UK, he kind of put all his energy into his work and trying to save money. He was a radio technician and a photographer. And so the two spend the rest of this coffee hour chatting and enjoying each other's company. And then afterwards, when they left the church and they both got home, they both found themselves thinking about the other. There was clearly an attraction there. And so the following Sunday, they both very eagerly rushed back to church in order to spend more time together. And sure enough, during that coffee hour, they spent the whole time together just chatting it up. And then afterwards, they exchanged phone numbers and made plans to get together outside of church. They were going to go on a date. And so the rest, as they say, is history. 2 years after Norbert complimented Lydia's shoes, they got married in Bracknell. And while the wedding was great, unfortunately, none of Lydia's family members, who were all in Ukraine, none of them could attend the actual wedding. And so the newlywed couple decided the way they would handle that is their honeymoon would be spent in Ukraine. That way Lydia's family could celebrate their wedding as well. For a variety of reasons, this honeymoon trip to Ukraine kept getting pushed back, but finally in September of 2021, everything lined up, everyone was available, and so Norbert and Lydia rushed to the airport and they hopped on a flight. And during this flight to Ukraine, Lydia remembers being so excited specifically about her husband finally getting a chance to spend some time with her 29-year-old younger brother Miroslav. Lydia was very close with her brother, and so it mattered to her greatly that he and her husband had a good relationship. But to that point, because of the great physical distance between the UK and Ukraine, the two had really not had that much interaction, and so they really didn't know each other very well. And so this trip was really important to Lydia, and Miroslav, he really picked up on that because he put together this camping trip for the end of their stay in Ukraine, where he knew he'd be able to step aside with Norbert and chat with him and get to know him a little bit. And so that was kind of like the fail-safe, where if he and Norbert did not get a chance to speak all week because they were visiting with so many people, they would have a chance to at the end of the week on this camping trip. So after a few hours of flying, Lydia and Norbert touch down in Ukraine, and they make their way to Lydia's family's house where they're going to be staying for the week. And that night, and for the next several days, the couple was swamped with several family reunions and meetups with old friends that hadn't seen Lydia in years. And so Norbert and Miroslav were not getting any time to themselves, and Lydia really knew that. And so she and Norbert began looking forward to this camping trip because that not only represented a kind of peaceful break from the chaos of all these reunions, but it also did represent the one chance they knew Miroslav and Norbert would get to interact with each other. And so finally, September 15th, the end of the week, it came, and it was time to go on this camping trip. And so Lydia and Norbert and Miroslav and 9 other family members, they all packed up their tents and their camping belongings, and they loaded up a couple of cars, and they drove over to the base of the Carpathian mountain range. This mountain range, which stretches for nearly 1,000 miles across Eastern and Central Europe, are very popular amongst tourists because it's stunningly beautiful. Everything is green and lush, and there are these crystal clear lakes and breathtaking waterfalls and all these amazing animals running around, and there's no mosquitoes, and they have these really cool hikes that bring you up to these very impressive overlooks. And so that night, Miroslav had made reservations for this one campsite, this very popular campsite that was up in this clearing, not too far up the mountain, and it had this great view down to the forest below, and because it was in a clearing, it had this unobstructed view up to the sky, where in this area, you could look up and just see stars in every direction. And so when Lydia and the rest of this group arrived in the parking lot of this mountain range, they were all really excited to get up to this campsite and just enjoy being there. And so they park their cars, they get their gear out, they find the trailhead, and then they begin hiking up the mountain. And about 2 hours later, they arrive at this clearing. They find their campsite, which was marked by this small fire pit underneath a couple of trees. And so they go over and they set their tents up, and some people go out and get some firewood. And then before long, a fire was made, and this group of 12 people that had not seen each other in so long, they just sat down and began enjoying each other's company. They put tea on, they were swapping stories. It was really just this wonderful time. And then around 8 p.m., the sun started to set, at which point this huge group just stopped and enjoyed this beautiful sunset. And then once the sun had gone down, there were 2 kids that were there on this trip, and so they were put to bed in their tent, and then the remaining 10 adults just kind of hung out by the fire and enjoyed each other's company. And it was actually during this second half of the night that Norbert and Miroslav finally really got a chance to just chat with each other. So for about an hour, they were talking to each other, and Lydia is just watching this happen, and she couldn't be happier. This is like the perfect ending to this trip. And then around 9 p.m., Norbert stands up. Lydia sees him stand up, and he tells the group he's going to run back to his tent, which was a ways away from the campfire, and he was going to get his camera. And so Lydia said, okay, no problem. And she remembers watching him walk off into the distance, because when you're at the campfire, if you're looking away from the campfire, everything is pitch black in that direction. And so she watches him disappear into the darkness, and then she and her brother and everyone else just kind of turn back towards the campfire. And then all she remembers about what happens next is she heard a whistling sound. And at first it was very faint, but it started to get very, very loud. And when it got loud, she tried to kind of figure out where it was. But before she could, suddenly something hit her in the face, predominantly hit her in the nose. And as soon as it did, she went blind, she went deaf, and then she felt herself on the ground, and she has no idea what's going on. And all she can remember thinking is, oh my God, something horrible has happened to me. I might die. I don't know what's happening, but I might die. And so she started praying for herself to survive whatever was happening to her. And then her hearing started to come back just a little bit. Her vision was still totally blurred. She could only kind of tell where the fire was because it was bright, but her hearing, it started to come back. And that's when she heard moaning coming from somewhere near her. And so she's thinking, okay, whatever horrible thing has happened to me has happened to other people too. And so instead of just praying for herself, she began praying for everyone who was at this campsite. And so as her hearing is getting louder and louder, and she's hearing more and more moaning and crying happening all around her, she suddenly hears her husband screaming her name. Her vision is still gone, but she knows it's him, and he lands right behind her and he grabs her and he's just repeating her name over and over and over again. And then Lydia manages to kind of choke out to her husband, what happened? And there's a pause, and then Norbert says to her, it's bad. It's really bad. It would turn out their campsite was on a battlefield from World War I, and buried underneath the soil right under their fire pit was an unexploded bomb from World War I. Meaning, for over 100 years, countless campers have arrived at this campsite and lit fires on top of this bomb that they couldn't see. And each fire gradually eroded the outer metal casing of this explosive until finally that night in September, with Lydia and 11 of her loved ones nearby, their little fire finally was it. It pushed through that last little bit of the casing and it ignited the bomb and it detonated. That whistling that she heard was the sound of the fire finally cutting through that casing and being exposed to the fire. And then that thing that struck her in the face, that hit her right on the nose, that was almost certainly a piece of the bomb itself. So shrapnel that was cutting through her face. And then the moaning she heard was primarily her brother, who was right next to her. Lydia would be gravely wounded, but she would survive. As for her brother and another man who was not named, they would not survive. Here is a picture that was taken of the group literally minutes before. I was in the military, and me and my unit were sent overseas to do some training. Now, normally, training for us consisted of doing things both on the land and also in the oceans. But when we got to this particular country, we were told by this country that we were not allowed to go in their waterways unless we had head-to-toe complete full body protection. And even then, it was still pretty risky. And so naturally we said, why? And they said, because our waterways are too toxic. They are too polluted. We were skeptical because previously we had dove and been in waters that were really, really hazardous. And so the idea that some trash was going to stop us from doing any training in the water seemed far-fetched. But when we got there and we walked down to the edge and looked out at the water, we were shocked. The water looked black from all the oil and pollution, and amidst this black sludge were thousands and thousands and thousands of pieces of plastic just bobbing on the surface in all directions. It was truly staggering. But what really amazed me was nobody was trying to fix this. There was no attempts being made to clean up this waterway. In fact, the opposite was happening. Because this waterway had gotten so bad, people had just kind of given up on it and just continued to dump trash and pollutants into this waterway. And so we would go out on our boats into this water. We would not go in it, but we'd be out in the water and we would look down and we would just see dead sea lions and dead birds and other dead marine animals just floating on the surface. And they had all most likely died from either eating plastic or getting trapped in plastic or consuming some other toxic pollutant. I mean, literally, their homes have become a death trap because because of this plastic and pollution crisis. And so a few weeks ago, when I was approached by MrBeast and his team to potentially help support their massive ocean cleanup that they call Team Seas, I immediately said yes. They are trying to raise $30 million by the end of this year in order to remove 30 million pounds of plastic and trash from the oceans, as well as from rivers and also from beaches. This project has the potential to truly change the planet, but we need your help. Every donation counts. I mean it. If you donate even just a single dollar to Team Seas, a full pound of trash and plastic will get removed from the ocean, guaranteed. So if you want to be a part of Team Seas with me and MrBeast and hundreds of other content creators and YouTubers and people all around the planet, go to teamseas.org today and give what you can. Thank you. So that's going to do it, guys. If you got something out of today's episode and you haven't done this already, the next time the like button is late for their flight, offer to give them a ride to the airport, but make sure you sneak several 3.5-ounce containers of toothpaste into their luggage. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 1 or 2 video uploads. We are now selling merchandise like flannels and hats and sweatshirts and all sorts of stuff. If you're interested, go to shopmrballen.com. If you want to learn about upcoming deals and promotions for our shop, go to our shop's Instagram page. The username is shopmrballen. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My username for both platforms is the same. It's MrBallen. I also have tons of content over on TikTok where my username is also MrBallen. We also have a second YouTube channel just called MrBallen Shorts, where we post random short videos and lost episodes. We also have a Facebook page where we post condensed versions of the longer episodes you see on YouTube, and that is just called MrBallen. If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called MrBallen. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, Facebook, or some combination, just know that I really appreciate your support. And until next time, that's going to do it.